Boom. What up? Today we're going to talk about raid throughput, saving wipes in progression, and the value of your time in the game World of Warcraft. This channel is a pretty simple thesis in that there's a pretty endemic failure within World of Warcraft raiding to understand why people wipe and the things that you can do to save wipes and save progression time and achieve a better ranking. So we're going to go through a case study in 10.2 where there's a rep farm that gets you an infinite augment rune that a lot of people just felt sort of mindlessly compelled to do, and I think that they just like wasted probably tens of thousands of hours of collective, human time for something that doesn't really matter. And we're going to talk about why I don't think it matters and some conclusions, some lessons that we can draw from that, maybe break down the process of how we can think about this kind of thing. So first of all, I think there are a few quantities that we want to estimate if we want to judge whether we, as sort of competitively minded raiders, should the quantities that we should use if we want to decide whether or not we're going to spend our time to farm this augment rune. First thing, what are the value of augment runes generally? Then, what is the marginal value of your augment rune? If I'm getting some value from the average augment rune, but I'm using them on 300 bosses or 300 pulls within a raid, probably like the first 100 augment runes I used were better than the next 100, and which were better than the last 100. So what is the value of the 300 first augment rune? And then the last thing that we maybe want to estimate is like, what is the counterfactual value of your time or your gold? Because there's always this sort of backdoor option we have to just purchase augment runes from the auction house. So should we be farming rep? Should we be buying things? Should we just go do something else with our lives? What should we do in order to pull bosses as little as possible? And I think this is obviously geared with the mindset that our goal is to clear the raid as quickly as possible with like minimal progression time and achieve a high ranking. If our goal is like to maximize our utility in life or something, maybe we should all be going and reading French literature and, I don't know, lying in the sun and not playing World of Warcraft, but we're going to assume that we care about our World of Warcraft ranking for the purpose of this analysis. So let's get at this first quantity. How much is raid throughput worth? Well, an augment rune on my 10.1.5 character simmed for something like 70% of a percent of throughput, which is to say 70 basis points, not that much throughput, something like 1,000 DPS on a character that does 130 something thousand in sim. Now, because augment runes give you a flat amount of main stat, we can assume that they're just going to be less and less relatively valuable as the season goes on, because characters get more and more main stat from their gear, and more main stat, more secondary stats. So, like at the beginning of the expansion, augment runes represent a huge relative power gain compared to where they are at the end of the expansion, when everyone has just way more gear and way more stats going around. So I think it's safe to say we can assume for the raid, across all your characters, you're going to get something like 0.5% of throughput on everybody from using augment runes. Like, that's not nothing. It's not a raid buff, but it's not nothing. So it's worth considering how much value that gives us. I think one analysis we can do here is talk about wipes saved. Like, why do we like throughput? Well, it makes killing bosses easier. Why does it make killing bosses easier? Like, you do more damage, they die quicker. Maybe that helps you beat enrage timers. Maybe that helps you beat like pseudo enrage timers, like killing an ad before a mechanic in a fight. Maybe it means that you spend less time in combat, so there's like less total time that things could go wrong or people can make mistakes. And then also lets you heal for more, so maybe you prevent some deaths that way. If we look at Sarkareth or Aberth the raid at all, there's a guild on Kazakh EU called Project that cleared the raid in 200 wipes, like World 15 or something. Probably like 20 hours of progress time. Maybe the average guild is something like 400, 500 wipes and like 50 hours of progress time or something like that, especially with better gear. But that tells us something that like a guild can save maybe 200 or 300 wipes. An average like good cutting edge guild that's sort of like Hall of Fame-ish, not top 50 in the world, not top 30, but not, the World Rank 1000 guild that, needs to turn on their monitors or something. Um, there's like a pool of 300 wipes that these guilds can save. Maybe a pool of like 20 or 30 progress hours that they could save. With that in mind, how many wipes do you think you would guess that having augment runes on every character on the raid for every pull of progression would save? Like if someone, I don't know, kidnapped you, forced you to give an answer to this question until they release you, what number would you write down? I have a number. I think it's probably lower than everybody else's number. But I think knowing that there's only 200 wipes that we really realistically could save from going from an average guild to one of the very best guilds in terms of efficiency is a little enlightening for like how big this rune number should be. And here I'm using project as opposed to like liquid or echo or method because I think the race to world first guilds are in a very different situation where like they really are throughput constrained on a lot of bosses because of how bad their gear is in week one. Whereas project is sort of more representative of a guild that has pretty good gear, especially in Aberrus, where the gear progression was so fast that like they did a lot of bosses with maybe like 2 or 3 less item levels than a mid-tier Hall of Fame guild might kill the bosses with, but the amount of like gear that they had was much more comparable, and so they're a better benchmark to compare against. So if we want to answer like how many wipes do runes save our guild across all of progression, how many wipes in general are just savable with more throughput at all? Sort of like if you gave everyone in your raid 100% more throughput, how many wipes do you think could be saved? And the answer is clearly not 200 because there are things on Sarkareth like knocking everyone off the platform. There's things like blowing up your raid with Volcanic Heart. There's things like hitting a lava geyser with the slam on Rashok and instantly killing everyone. There's a lot of mistakes in raid that are like never going to be saved with infinite throughput because people just die instantly, or like there's some checkpoint that you're failing, like some mechanical thing that cannot be overcome with more damage or more healing. I think that number of like mechanical wipes is actually very high, probably like on the order of 150 to 180 or something, in that like most wipes that happen are because things are going like disastrously wrong with mechanics. Like people are just doing basic things wrong with mechanics. The entire raid is dead instantly. 50% of the raid dies because someone misses mechanics, something like that, where even if you had more throughput than your raid could possibly gain from all sources, you were never going to kill that boss no matter what. Another way to put this is like, what is the throughput difference between your average, good cutting edge guild and the highest throughput players? And I think if you look at Warcraft logs without looking at like the most degenerate rank 1, 6 times power infusion parses or whatever, the difference from going from like a 70th percentile parse to a 95th or 99th percentile parse is something like 7 to 10% DPS on a lot of specs, especially on a lot of specs that don't have weird rankings effects. Like Unholy DK will have a much higher percent gain because at the top end they have the Neltharion weapon that gives them 5,000 damage, and they're getting more power infusions, and they're getting other externals or things like that sum up to more damage. But if you just look at like specs that are mostly affected by player skill and not things like RNG or externals as you go up the rankings, the difference is like 7 to 10% between these two percentile rankings. So you can't gain that much overall throughput. And to that end, getting augment runes is maybe like a 20th of all of the possible throughput that you could gain as a raid, going from like a medium good player to a very good player. And maybe we say if you gain all of that possible throughput, like you fully cross that throughput gap, you're saving all of the like throughput savable wipes that existed. Any wipe where you wipe to not having enough throughput, you're now saving that. I think that number is probably like 20 to 30 or 20 to 40 in Aberrus. And if you think that augment runes give you a 20th of that, it's hard to come up with estimates where augment runes are saving you more than 0 to 5 wipes. I think is like 5 is like a very, very conservative upper bound here. If you're thinking that augment runes are going to save your raid 20 wipes, then having them like play slightly better or do better focus targeting, or like have better enchantments on their gear, all have to be equivalently worth like 20 wipes each, and then somehow you're saving 100 wipes from all these minor changes. The math just doesn't add up. Like, mechanics are very important, and if your raid is not doing them perfectly, you're wiping to them much more frequently than you're wiping to throughput. Cool, so that's like the average augment rune value, or like the total value that you can accrue by using augment runes all the time. Let's say it's 5 wipes. I think that's still an overestimate, and really the real number is probably like 1 or 2, but 5, we can go with that. So what about the marginal value? We're going to do a little math. The marginal value of an augment rune is the derivative of the total value with respect to the number of runes you've used. In another way to say that without invoking any calculus is saying, like, after you've used some amount of runes, how much is like the next single rune that you use saving you? Or if we're going to graph something like the fraction of total rune value captured, which we've said is now 5 wipes, versus the fraction of pulls that you've used runes on, where you're sorting that by importance of like how valuable those pulls are. What does this graph look like? And what do like points on this graph represent? Well, I think like 1 point on this graph is 1, 1, which says if you're using runes on 100% of the pulls, then you're capturing 100% of the rune value. That sort of has to be true. Similarly, at the origin, like at 0, 0, if you never use augment runes, you're not capturing any of the value of using runes. And then so a point like XY is saying if you use runes on the X% most important pulls of the tier, you're capturing Y% of the total value of using augment runes on every pull. I think that this graph looks sort of like some very sublinear thing, where maybe a point on that graph is like 0.1, 0.75, which would say if you use augment runes on 10%, like the 10% most important pulls in the raid, you're probably getting 75% of the value. In other words, the marginal value of an augment rune is really fucking low. It's really low. And this just like has to make sense if you think about all the pulls that you do in a raid. Using an augment rune for your first 100 pulls of Sarkareth, when you're just dying in phase 1 or phase 2 because people don't know what to do or you haven't come up with a good strategy yet, is obviously pointless. Like, you're not saving any wipes by using them there. Using augment runes on Assault of the Zakali when you're going to one-shot it and never die is not worth anything. It cannot save you any wipes when you're not wiping to a boss. Using augment runes on Ziskarn when you're like cheesing the boss and standing in a corner and can't really die to throughput is never worth anything. The only times that augment runes really save you wipes is when you're throughput limited, and those have to be like the 5 or 10% of pulls where you can kill a boss but aren't killing it yet for throughput reasons. All this goes to say that like a thing we can do is capture a huge fraction of the value of augment runes by selectively using them on the most important pulls. And so we don't need to like farm an infinite augment rune when we could just buy some and use them when we know that they're going to be valuable. So then the third component of this equation is like, how much time did we spend farming rep? Because I think it's sort of obviously true that even though these augment runes aren't very valuable, if you could get them with 10 minutes of investment and save 5 wipes for your raid, that's a great trade to make. That's just obviously good. Everyone should go do that. But I think unless you were exploiting the like rep macro stuff very early on, probably people were spending 4 to 8 hours farming rep this week across 20 to 25 people for your entire raid. It's like 120 human hours of effort for something that's maybe going to save you 5 pulls across the entire raid. That seems like a lot of time for something that we haven't really justified as being that valuable. So let's go through a couple common rebuttals to say, like, why is this time investment not worth this value that we're getting? Well, first one, people say you get a Worm's Crest at Renown 20. This is true. You do get an enchanted Worm's Crest. This might be the case that the enchanted Worm's Crest doesn't come from the Fyrak or like Emerald Dream campaign for killing Fyrak, in which case this is a like exclusive bonus you get and is maybe meaningful. But let's not forget that like in Vault of the Incarnates and in Aberrus, you got an enchanted Worm's Crest for killing the end boss, and people didn't really use them. Now, obviously, you're more incentivized to use them now because crests are more limited. They're a scarcer resource. But it wasn't like you always had this opportunity to craft with your Worm's Crest prior, and no one cared. And I don't think the calculus has shifted that much. Embellishments are still really good. Having a high item level stat chosen piece is still really good, especially if it's going to be like your fucking main hand weapon. Still really good. It's not that big of a bonus to get the Worm's Crest. In particular, getting Worm's Crest on your raid, even if you think it is a bonus in terms of like a slightly better allocation of your crests, it just boils down to another throughput question. And we've concluded that like saving, 0.1% or 0.2% raid throughput cannot be worth more than like 1 or 2 pulls across the entire raid tier. So this Worm's Crest can't be worth that much additional value when it's just representing such a small increase in throughput for your entire raid. Now, if this said like you're going to get 3 extra sparks and 3 extra aspect crests, like holy shit, yeah, go do that. That's fucking insane. But Worm's Crest is not that exciting. Another thing that's true, you save gold. This is like kind of true, but augment runes are like 1,300 gold on the auction house right now, in part because everyone is farming infinite augment runes and not buying regular augment runes. So, look, I bought like 700 augment runes, which will cover my entire raid for 1 million gold or so. That was like the cut from 3 or 4 sales of the raid at the end of the tier, which most people should be doing anyway. If you care about competitive World of Warcraft, there's not a ton of stuff that you can spend gold on other than like boosting alts or like buying mounts off the black market auction house. Like gold just isn't that valuable. And you can buy a lot of draconic augment runes for relatively cheaply right now. They're not, this isn't a year ago when they were 10,000 gold and it was absurd to use them for every pull. But like very realistically, lots of players who don't focus on farming gold and just sell a couple carries over the course of the season can cover their entire raid tier from those sale proceeds. It's not that big of an expense, especially when we determine that like you could probably buy 70 to 100 augment runes for 100,000, 200,000 gold and cover almost all of your most important pulls and capture a huge fraction of the value of having the infinite augment rune. So you don't really save that much gold. And in particular, if 100,000 gold is a major expense for you in a World of Warcraft raiding guild, like you can make 100,000 gold in less time than it takes to farm the infinite augment rune. This is like you just kind of have it backwards. Like gold can be generated with time. Your time has a value, and so all of our previous arguments about like the time investment can equivalently apply to the gold investment. The third thing people say, there's nothing else to do right now. I might as well play the game for 100 hours if it's going to get me, up 1% of 1% throughput. People especially make this argument with like even Race World first players who have maybe the best claim to do degenerate things early. But for a lot of like middling players, it really strikes me like they have not fully explored the possible space of things that you could do. To put this another way, if someone locked you in a room for 4 hours, like some padded, white room, and all they told you is like, you have to think of ways to get better at World of Warcraft. That's it. You have no other task in this room. You just have like 4 hours with your thoughts. You have to brainstorm things that you could do, ways that you could try and get better, like immediate actions you could take, things you could change. I think anyone who plays the game a lot could come up with lots of things that they could be doing better in those 4 hours. Like, that's without access to a computer. That's without actually practicing or playing the game. You could just like sit and think by yourself and come up with lots of ways to raid better and save pulls and progression that would save you just as many or more pulls than farming the infinite augment rune. So in other words, there's always something else to do in the game because you don't have to play the game to make your raiding more efficient. If your argument is like, I care so much about raid progression that I'm willing to spend as many hours as possible this week to save a few pulls next week, then you have to justify that expensive time by explaining to me and demonstrating that you've exhausted all other options. Like, you have to do the most efficient use of your time at all times before you can say that spending 10 hours to save a couple pulls with this augment rune is really the best thing you could be doing. So what are some other things you could be doing? Like, what are the options that people have not exhausted? Like, how much time have you spent learning the raid fights and dungeons of this tier? If you farm Mythic Plus and you wipe your Mythic Plus group because you don't understand a boss or you don't understand some trash mechanic, like, those are minutes of your time that you could have saved by learning the dungeons better this week. And if you like waste lots of minutes because you wipe your raid or because maybe you don't complete enough hard Mythic Plus keys over the course of the week and you're undergeared as a result, like, congratulations, there was stuff you could have done not just this week but over the last 10 weeks that would have saved you pulls in progression or would have saved you time over the course of the season. Similarly with raid fights, like, if you don't know what the abilities of the raid bosses do, why the fuck are you farming an augment rune instead of just like getting better at the fights? It's completely counterintuitive to tell me that the most important thing to do to raid better is not to know how to play the raid and how to kill the bosses, but to like get slightly more throughput. When so many of your wipes come from people misunderstanding mechanics, misplaying mechanics, not being prepared to do things. What are some other things you could do? Do you know the ability timers of all the bosses? Like, similarly, if you can't tell me the like sequence of abilities the boss is going to cast, you should not be farming an augment rune. You should be like watching PTR footage and learning what Smolderon does. Do you know the most important damage events? Do you know whether some big damage event is going to kill you if you're at 70% health? If you're at half health, should you health pot? If you use a major defensive on one of those damage events, will it be up for the next big damage event? Or will you have to like rotate your defensive in some clever way? These are all somewhat knowable now. Maybe not for the later bosses that are going to get hot fixed or that haven't been tested fully. But for a lot of the raid fights, like, these are kind of answerable questions. And if you haven't answered them, you should be answering them instead of farming an infinite augment rune and like wasting your time in the Emerald Dream. Is your UI good? If you wipe your raid because your UI is bad, you have like cost your raid more time than you have saved by farming the augment rune, because your entire raid is probably saving 5 wipes over 20 people for farming it. If you wipe them once, you've just like wasted more than you saved per person. Don't do this. You should fix your UI. There are other things that you could do. So like we said, everyone in your raid is probably spending 4 to 8 hours. That's like 1 or 2 raid nights. What if you spent an entire raid night of just VOD review from the tier? What if you pulled up progression VODs and you went through as a group and you said, like, look, here's the thing that caused our mistake. Here's the mispositioning that happened earlier in the fight that caused this player to like have to use some ability that left them stranded later and they died. Here's why this person was out of position and caused a wipe. Here's where we had a bad strategy and could have refined it by like making a few small adjustments to the way we use our cooldowns. Like, these things all save raid progression because you get better as players. Do people in your guild know the kinds of mistakes that they tend to make, and do they have plans to correct them in the future? If not, why the fuck are you farming an infinite augment rune? You're going to save 50%, or you're going to save 0.5% of throughput when people repeatedly make the same mistakes, like forgetting to hit major cooldowns, or consistently not listening to their weak ores, or consistently mispositioning for expected events. These are just like all things that are solvable ahead of time, and you should solve them. And that's sort of the general thesis we have. Every tier, guilds are going to wipe dozens of times to things that were very, very solvable and were like knowably solvable before the tier even started. If you're not solving them now, why are you spending your time farming for slightly more throughput? These are just like completely incongruent courses of action. Sort of to that end, I think it's totally okay if your answer to all this is that like, I'm farming for this augment rune because I like playing World of Warcraft and it's fun for me to sit in Discord with my friends and like shoot the shit with them and kind of half-heartedly play the game. That's a totally reasonable position to have, but then you cannot ever tell me that you are a competitive player who cares about like their raid progression and their rank, because you demonstrably are doing things that are hurting your progression at the expense of just like having more fun. Much in the same way that like AOTC players who don't do the rotation properly and don't sim their character and like don't pick the right talents because they think one other talent is cooler or more fun to play with, they're like sacrificing personal performance for fun. You're no better than them. Like in the grand scheme of progression, you're just starting from a sort of higher point on the like progression curve. You're just doing the exact same thing of saying like, I'm going to set some barrier and say, I'm not going to push myself to be more competitive than this. I'm just going to sacrifice further progression for having fun. And again, like that's fine, but we have to recognize that these are choices we're making. We're not being the most competitive players that we could be when we're farming for this augment rune. We're just doing it to have fun and like dick around and hang out with our buddies. And if we're going to make those choices, we should at least be conscious that those are the choices we're making.